Are we any closer to knowing what the Obama administration's strategy for dealing with ISIS is? Does the administration have a strategy or even a clue? And can the U.S. stop suspected American-born terrorists from re-entering the country? Plus, Democrats are fueling up the war on women talk again. I'm going to ask a panel of women what they really want from the government. And rock and roll legend Sam Moore with a musical tribute to the late George Jones. That and more tonight on Huckabee. Hello, everybody. I'm Mike Huckabee, and thanks for joining us. No one expects a president to be perfect. We understand they've got flaws, and sometimes their flaws are for something they say or the way they say it. It sometimes is just an awkward turn of phrase that haunts them forever.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is. Yes.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be a bit charming, even humanizing.
Fool me once. Shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
But sometimes one has to wonder if the president just want to keep from being straightforward.
As your commander-in-chief, I will not commit you and the rest of our armed forces to fighting another ground war in Iraq.
But then his people leave the door wide open.
If there are threats to the United States, then I, of course, would go back to the president and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces.
Of course, after that, the president was then forced to promise yet again, read my lips, no new wars. Well, until there is another one. It appears that President Obama can't really figure out if we're in a war or just a counter-terrorism action. Last week on our show, retired General Jay Garner wasn't fuzzy at all about exactly what we're doing.
If we're sending soldiers, airmen, sailors over there to fight and perhaps be killed, then we're at war.
Well, President Obama and his people are all about avoiding the W word.
Yes or no, is America at war?
Well, you know, I'm going to answer that, Mr. Chairman, but I'm not going to...
This ought to be pretty simple.
You know...
Please?
A lot of people are debating this idea of what do you call it? You call it war, don't you call it war?
Yeah.
It's not a war like Iraq.
For heaven's sakes, Secretary Kerry, what is it? But when pressed, it's hard to call our little dust-up with ISIS anything else, or we look like idiots. If President Obama had been president on December 7th, 1941, he probably would have said this. Well, we've had an unfortunate little misunderstanding with our good friends, the Japanese. Some airplanes from Japan got sort of carried away in some mischief, and, well, we might have pretty much lost our entire fleet. We're not exactly at war, but we might have to bust them up a little bit. Look, there's long been the understanding of something called the fog of war. That means that once a war starts, there's chaos and confusion. But this may be the first time that the fog is whether we are at war. The president often says he wants to be clear.
Let me be clear, but let me be clear. Let me be clear.
Yeah, well, okay. Maybe he just doesn't know exactly what that means.
Are we clear? Crystal.
That, my friend, is clarity. Our military is often called upon for humanitarian missions like the one the president announced this week in sending 3,000 troops to assist in the Ebola virus outbreak. But our armed forces are not trained to serve as hospital orderlies, but to overwhelm enemies with massive force. We've attempted to operate in Iraq and Afghanistan with limited personnel and limited force. The result, long and drawn-out campaigns that have muddled missions and have unclear objectives. Better not use the military than to use them for anything less than the type of operation that makes the world scared to death to unleash them. You know, we learn in grade school, on the playground, that the bully never messes with the kid who can kick his butt. He messes with the one that he knows can't or won't. We need to be the nation that no one wants to poke, knowing that if we stand up, they fall down. I mean, if someone were to break into my house and threaten my family, I'd use the strongest weapon at my disposal to stop him and protect them. By the way, I have an arsenal of weapons, and I'd not hesitate to use them to stop an intruder. Then I'd call 911, not to tell the police to come and stop the bad guy, but to tell them where to come and pick up the carcass of the one who tried to hurt my loved ones. Now, yes, I might be able to yell at them, hit them with a baseball bat, throw a knife at them, or even run from them. But I'm more confident in a couple of friends named Smith and Wesson. You know, folks, we don't have a military because we want to use them. We have them so that if we do need them, there will be no doubt as to the outcome. And there is nothing unclear about that. Well, as we saw on Tuesday, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, told the Senate Armed Services Committee that he could potentially ask the President to put ground troops in Iraq. On Wednesday, at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Secretary of State John Kerry was asked, if it becomes clear the only way to defeat ISIS would be to put boots on the ground, would the President consider General Dempsey's recommendation?
The President will not put American ground troops into Iraq. I understand the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whose job it is to look at it from his perspective in terms of his military and his judgment. But the President's made a judgment as Commander-in-Chief that that's not in the cards, and that's where we are.
Well, joining me now is retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Dan Hampton. Colonel, great to have you back on the show. Appreciate your being here.
Thanks, Governor. It's good to be here.
Colonel, at least 4 different military generals and experts have said that we really can't go in and destroy ISIS with only air power. There has to be some type of combat action on the ground. Agree, disagree?
I agree, but what I would caveat that with is they don't have to be American boots on the ground. You're exactly right. You cannot win a war from the air. We tried that in the Gulf Wars. We tried that in that little fracas 50 years ago called the Vietnam War. It doesn't work. Air power used in conjunction with boots on the ground will work, but going back to what you said a few minutes earlier, they've got to get the semantics right and the objective right and the goals right before they start to get serious about that. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of shiny coffins coming back through Dover Air Force Base.
And Colonel, one of the things I think a lot of us are concerned about is that there's this muddled message as to whether or not this is going to be a warlike action, or what else is there? When you start sending people into harm's way, loaded with weapons, and they're shooting to kill people, what can you call it other than a war? And from your perspective as a warrior, does it even matter?
It doesn't matter to me when I'm there, and I had no ethical or moral ambiguities in any fight that I was ever in. But it does matter from the larger political standpoint and support and what happens afterwards. We saw what happened in Iraq because there was no plan after the war, because nobody would really admit that from 2003 to 2011 that there was still a war going on. And I would say that if the Kerry, Obama, Biden show can't decide what to call this, then we shouldn't commit anybody until they can.
Colonel, I get the impression that nobody from the Pentagon is really being listened to in the White House or in the State Department. Here's my question. You're retired, so you can get away with answering this. You couldn't if you were on active duty. Is there not a point at which some senior military people are going to have to publicly resign and say, I'm not going to disobey an order from the Commander-in-Chief, but I'm not going to follow orders that don't make sense? Are we going to see that happen?
Boy, I sure hope so. I was never a general officer, thankfully. I didn't want to deal with that. And I've got to believe that some of them up there would rather fall on their sword, if you will, than be a part of something that isn't going to make sense from the beginning. You were talking about the fog of war. Well, we're used to that on a battlefield, but what you don't want is fog being generated from your own side, and that's what's coming out of the White House, is just pure fog.
I want to talk about Iran because you and I may have a different opinion on this, but the Iranians have, maybe offered some level of assistance. How in the world can we trust the Iranians, their government, not their people, but their government? How can we trust them?
Well, they might say the same thing about us, and what I would say, at this point in history, I think it's time to be pragmatic about who our allies are over there, and that also includes Syria, if you want to talk about that. But the Iranians never really had much of an issue with us until the 70s and the Shah and Mossadegh and some of the other things that happened. And they know that they've got a problem in their own country now with the majority of their population being too young to remember any of that. They know they've got an economic problem that would choke a horse. We've got the answers to some of that. I'm not saying unconditionally give in to them or trust them, because you don't really ever trust anybody. But I'm saying that there's some room there, and they could really be a big help. For instance, their economy's in a bad way. All right, we can go a long way to resolving some of that under the condition of, say, they're not funding terrorism anymore. And, you know, in one sweep here, we could cut the knees off of Hezbollah and half a dozen other terror groups that I could think of that the Iranians fund. I think they would do that in return for economic assistance and some international recognition and a chance to be involved in this. Because face it, they're in the region. They're like Syria. Okay, ISIS is much closer to home for them than it is for us.
Well, considering how much funding that they've put toward Hamas and Hezbollah, and the statements of their leaders that they want to wipe Israel from the face of the map, I hope that there could be something, but I'll be very, very reluctant unless they repudiate some of those comments about Israel and they absolutely eliminate their checkbook. But I do understand where you're coming from. Colonel, great to have you back. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks. Always a pleasure.
So what can our government do to prevent Americans suspected of terrorism to travel back and forth to Iraq and Syria and then come back as they please? I'll ask former Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz when we come back.